Hello, my curious cats, and welcome back to another episode of the Psychology podcast, the podcast for all the info on psychology's most questionable history. I'm your host, Leslie Lopez, PhD student and psychology nerd. Okay, honest question, how are you? How is everybody? Because with so much going on in the world right now, I know it can be really, really hard to focus on what's going on in our personal lives, okay? And sometimes it can be hard to remember that it is very important to take care of ourselves. Like I said, there's so much going on. We have genocide, we have famine, we have homelessness issues, it's an election year where, let's be honest, both candidates. And then people can't afford groceries. There's a recession going on, whether we like to admit it or not. It feels like everything is just up against us right now. So like I said, it can be very, very hard to just focus on what we do have over what we don't have. So let's just try to take one day at a time. At least that's how I'm taking it right now. Personally, I have so much going on these next few weeks. I have to constantly remind myself not to just take every day at a time, but to take every minute, every second at a time. That's how life is going right now for so many people out there. So, like I said, let's just try to regroup and remember that what's important is what we do have over what we don't have. But anyways, for this week's episode, we're diving into some crazy experiments that just so happen to have occurred at a place that is all too familiar to me. It's exciting, but it's also a little bit terrifying. This week, we're looking at the Oregon and Washington experiments of the effects of radiation on testicles. Yes, testicles. A study that was led by the University of Washington that was intended for scientific purposes turned into one of the most dangerous experiments on prison test subjects to date. So, if you're a little bit insane in the membrane like me, get cozy tozy and let's jump into it. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you could definitely see that I'm wearing my one of many UW crew necks because I am a proud Husky. Go Dogs. I got both my bachelors from there. Criminal justice and psychology. Go figure. And today's study happens to take place at the University of Washington. So, gotta rep. Once again, we are headed back in time, not to the 1950s this time, but close. We are headed to the 1960s and 1970s, right at the peak of the Cold War. Nuclear testing was seeing some major breakthroughs in the science community, but things weren't exactly perfect, given that it was all still very relatively new. Nuclear and radiation accidents were happening left and right. And although it did allow for questions to be answered at the end of most of these experiments, scientists were left with more questions than answers than they had originally begun with. All right, so get ready because we're going to be learning some fun facts about Washington State here, stuff that I didn't even know, and I've lived here my whole life. Did you know that the city of Hanford, Washington is home to the federal complex that produced plutonium for the nation's first atomic bomb in the early 1940s? I didn't know that. Plutonium is a chemical element that, when exposed to air, acts as a field to power nuclear reactors, and it's one of the primary fuels used for nuclear weapons. In 1962, in the city of Hanford, 4 men were working near a plutonium solution when a nuclear criticality happened. Okay, now bear with me because I am neither a math nor a science person, so I'm going to briefly try to explain what this means, but if I'm being honest, even in layman's terms, it's all foreign to me. A nuclear criticality is a condition involving fission of nuclear materials when the number of neutrons produced equals or exceeds the nuclear containment. And when sufficient nuclear material, such as plutonium, come together to go critical, it results in a flush of gamma neutrons and gamma rays that deliver a lethal dose in a fraction of a second. Honestly, all I got from that was lethal dose in a fraction of a second, which, as we all can guess, is not a good thing. And we'd be right, that is not a good thing. But these 4 workers were extremely lucky because they managed to escape and survive to tell the story. However, they were exposed to radiation doses ranging from 1.43 to 110 rems. Now, once again, my apologies, I am not 100% sure what that means, but what I do know is that according to nuclear scientists, the limit for nuclear workers today is 5 rems a year. And these guys reached 110 rems in the split of a second and survived. So that's that for perspective. Now, although radiation and nuclear chemicals were still a relatively new concept, some of its health consequences were already known, especially to those working closely with it. After the accident, the 4 workers were extremely concerned about their health, as they should be, and 3 questions plagued their minds more than anything. Would the accident make them sterile? If they could have children, what would that mean for the offspring? And could the accident give them cancer? When the city of Hanford learned of the details of this accident, they quickly contacted one of the best male fertility experts in the state of Washington. Please welcome to the stage Dr. C. Alvin Poulsen. At the time, Poulsen was an assistant professor and male fertility expert at the University of Washington Medical School. Go dogs! He was called to examine the men and help them answer these 3 questions. Sadly, at the moment, Poulsen couldn't give the workers a straight answer. In later years, he told the city officials, quote, "I couldn't really answer them. There was very little in the scientific literature." Because remember, radiation and nuclear chemicals were still relatively new to the science community. Now, the city of Hanford wasn't going to take no for an answer. They needed answers, so they encouraged Poulsen to apply for a federal research grant through the University of Washington to test the effects of radiation on male fertility. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? Except, where would they find voluntary subjects who were willing to subject themselves to radiation to the gonads, all in the name of science? The answer, my curious cats, is, sadly, the prison system. Poulsen was actually encouraged to test on prisoners in the nearby prison of Walla Walla. Prisoners were considered ideal subjects because it would be easy to do as many follow-up studies as needed because, quote, they were a population that wasn't going anywhere. Wow. The experiment was quickly approved in 1963 because remember, these were the years of the Cold War, and events such as the Cuban Missile Crisis had increased the fears of nuclear war among the American public, and the American military was demanding answers about radiation effects. At the time that Poulsen was applying for the grant and the experiment approval, an old research buddy of his down in Oregon caught word of his experiment and wanted in. His name was Dr. Carl Heller. Heller was actually a professor of Poulsen's at the Seattle Pacific Northwest Research Foundation before he moved to Oregon to teach there. When Heller heard about his former student's experiment, he too applied for a similar grant, also using prisoners for his test subjects, except he would retrieve them from the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, Oregon. Together, these 2 experiments cost over $1.5 million, which is equivalent to about $15.5 million today. For science, right? Now, even though the test subjects were prisoners, the experiment still had to have some kind of element of it being voluntary to it, obviously. So what they did was that the 2 doctors went to the prison and spoke to the inmates about the project, enticing them with cash, commissary, early parole, and most importantly, the inmates were also assured that the tests were completely safe. Now remember, the whole point of these experiments was to test the long-term effects of testicular exposure to radiation because there was very little reliable human information available at the time. Past events such as Hiroshima and Nagasaki, although not specific to testicular radiation, suggested that the likelihood of inducing cancers with the amount of radiation these 2 doctors planned to use was very small. Dozens of prisoners applied and lined up to be part of this human radiation experiment. After psychological interviews, physical examinations, and reassurance that they weren't Roman Catholic, only 64 in Washington and 67 in Oregon were handpicked. The ones that were picked were handed consent forms that they were made to read and then sign. These consent forms included further information about the experiment, including the procedures. These procedures including collecting semen samples, hence why they wouldn't allow Roman Catholics, collecting urine for hormonal studies, submitting to testicular biopsies, receiving oral or injected medication, and getting a vasectomy at the end of the experiment. Now, one thing's for certain, it was made very clear to the inmates that as far as health benefits go, there were none. The benefits of the experiment to the inmate were in the form of financial and potential freedom incentives. At the time, inmates were typically paid 25 cents a day, and for those participating in the experiment, they would earn $25 for each testicular biopsy, which each participant had to receive 5 or more, with an addition of $25 for their vasectomy at the end of the experiment. Look, I'm all for men getting vasectomies, If anything, I think it should be a requirement until they can prove that they're responsible enough to not be shooting it anywhere and everywhere. But the whole scene here is a little eerie. You know what I mean? So because they were testing the long-term effects, these experiments went on from 1963 to 1973 in both states. During these 10 years, the inmates stripped down and offered their gonads to what science called reproductive radiation tests. The goal of these reproductive radiation tests was to determine the dose at which the men would lose their fertility and then track their recovery. That sentence alone is quite a lot to take in. During these tests, the men would lay down, exposing their testicles to a machine mounted over them. The testicles were then placed on a small bag of sugar because the granules prevented radiation from being deflected to damage other organs. And we wouldn't want that because we're only damaging the testicles here, remember? The doses of radiation these men were receiving were in 10-minute increments and ranged from 7 to 400 rems. By comparison, a diagnostic x-ray machine that you receive at the doctor's ranges from 0.01 to 1 rem. Again, I'm no scientist, but that doesn't sound healthy, especially to such a sensitive area. So I hear. Okay, so at the 15 rem mark, Poulsen and Heller noticed that some sperm were killed. At 50 rems, all sperm died. And at 400 rems, which only 2 men were healthy enough to receive, they temporarily lost their fertility and it took them over 500 days for it to return. The inmates were examined for up to 6 years to measure any and all changes in their hormones and sperm count, if there were any. According to Poulsen, quote, "We discovered that men were very sensitive to short-term sterility, a lot more than dogs," unquote. Like, honestly, what a weird thing to say, but okay. The inmates were encouraged to have vasectomies to prevent the possibility of defective offspring. All except for 8 did so. At the time, Poulsen and Haller truly believed that the experiments led to some valuable information. However, one could argue that the end doesn't justify the means. In fact, Poulsen, Mr. University of Washington, wanted to continue his experiments. However, they had to come to an end when he was denied permission for a second round by the Human Experiments Committee at the University of Washington. According to the committee, they felt that there were some very serious risks. Apparently, neutron radiation is no joke. You can literally die from it. And the only reason Poulsen was able to conduct the first round was because the committee didn't exist in 1963. Essentially, the risks outweighed the scientific benefits. One of the elements discussed by the committee was whether prisoners were true volunteers. The question was, could there really be any true informed consent, or were these individuals either so bored or so desperate that they'd take any opportunity? This question is very valid, given that the incentives that the inmates were given if they were chosen to participate were only beneficial to inmates. The last of the radiation experiment was administered in 1968, and as the experiment ended, so did the follow-ups. The methods of the experiment intended long-term follow-up through annual medical exams to ensure that the men didn't develop tumors or other possible unknown issues, but those follow-ups never happened because the experiments were banned from continuation. Sooner or later, the inmates learned that the experiments that were led by the University of Washington on behalf of the federal government were a lot riskier than they were led to believe. It's believed that some subjects suffered from testicular cancer, infertility, and life-altering medical conditions, including death, that resulted from these tests. However, because there weren't any more follow-ups, there is no way to be 100% sure. Which, if you think about it, I get the reason for wanting to block a second round of experiments. However, given everything the inmates went through, you would think that the follow-ups would be imperative to not only science, but the health and the justice for these inmates as well? Or am I just thinking too blue and too left here? But anyways, upon learning the details of the radiation experiment, many former Washington state prisoners filed a lawsuit in federal court in 1996. At the time of the lawsuit, over 20 years after the last experiment had been conducted, 40 of the 64 Washington inmates had died, and of the 24 survivors, 16 testified in court. In 1999, the court decided that the prisoner's federal constitutional rights and Washington state common law rights had been violated by Poulsen and his research team. In 2000, a $2.4 million compensation suit was settled favoring the former inmates. As for Oregon, in 1976, 9 of the inmates filed lawsuits alleging poorly supervised research, lack of informed consent, and the experimental procedures resulted in considerable pain and discomfort that they were not prepared for. In 1979, these suits were settled out of court, and the 9 inmates shared $2,215 in damages. Wow. So, not as complicated as Washington, but there was still significant physical and psychological damages to all inmates nonetheless. Although the psychological damages weren't spoken up as much as the physical damages, many of the former inmates in both states did speak up about their depression, anxiety, and PTSD post-radiation, both while still being incarcerated and after they were released. This completely makes sense because further studies tell us that any amount of high exposure to radiation can have a significant effect on certain parts of the brain by reducing the blood supply that reaches certain areas such as the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, and the temporal lobes. Damage to these areas can result in symptoms of amnesia, language disorders, and loss of neuron connections. One thing about Poulsen, Mr. University of Washington, is that he defended his experiments up until his death in 2008. He believed a lot was gained and a lot more could have been gained had the experiments not been blocked for a second round. Which is funny because Poulsen admitted at the beginning of his experiments that he knew nothing about radiation. Like, if you think about it, he was an expert in male fertility and cancer. But who am I to question the US government, right? Well, my curious cats, thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. Honestly, I'd never thought I'd see the day where I felt sorry for a man's testicles. Or for a man in general. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please remember to follow, subscribe, like, review, and comment on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Your support means the world. Please comment any suggestions you may have for future episodes because I want to know what y'all want to know. As always, citations will be in the description if you want to check those out. Stay blessed, stay sane, and stay psyched. I love you. Bye.